most important challenge with like tuberculosis eradication. Contagious disease, you have to eradicate, you have to just catch all the patients with one single go. You cannot just let it spread. The cost to find these patients started increasing drastically. Honestly, when we deployed it, we did not have this very great understanding. All we knew was it's very difficult to find radiologists to read, so can you use AI? Now the vans could go into a remote area, they could just process it on right then and there. Like within 30 seconds, you would have a result whether they're likely positive or not. Yeah, and you catch hold of the patient right then and there. Get the sputum test done, 1 hour, you're done with this entire thing. And if they're positive, you just get them on medication right then and there. So what was almost like a 20-day thing just shortened down to like 2 hours.
What do you guys celebrate?
Patient stories of someone, say, if I had not intervened, wouldn't have received the treatment or would have died very likely in case of a stroke. And then they actually helped do that. For me also personally, that just creates a very deep sense of impact that you actually did save someone's life. Forget everything that you build, you saved someone's life, and that single person's life saved is just worth so much in value. Like, I don't care as much, honestly. That just is massive, I think.
Okay guys, so today we have Rohit Ghosh, who is the co-founder and Chief Commercial Officer at Cure AI, which is a company that uses AI to interpret medical imaging. One of the first use cases they had was for tuberculosis, where they essentially applied an AI to the images to help radiologists. And they found that in certain countries, the ratio between radiologists and the patients across the country was just abysmally low, as much as 8 to 10 times lower than, say, the States, like in India. It was much lower. And he founded the company in 2016, and they've raised over $50 million since. And they've created the world's most adopted healthcare AI, impacting over 20 million lives. Rohit is actually deeply technical, and it was a very fascinating discussion. He's published over 15 publications in journals, and he's even published 100 plus lectures on machine learning and AI back in 2017. So he was there super early, which I found fascinating. So in this episode, you want to stick around because we're going to be talking about what it's like starting a deep tech company from 0 to 50 million. So if you're looking to start a company or you're just interested in the space and you want to know what it's like and how it's different to good old AJ sitting in his underwear doing Facebook ads all day, right? Like, what is the difference between a deep tech company and a traditional business? And we also talk about some of the advancement that Cure AI is doing, and we look at it from a technical perspective. So make sure you tune in and stay to the end. Catch you later. I think the place I want to start is the fact that I think in deep tech, timing is very hard, right? Like, before I met you, I started a quantum computing company, and then I had to give up because it's too early. Like, we were just way too early to the space. And I didn't think it was 3 to 5 years away, right? And I think for deep tech, right now, the reason I'm doing this podcast is trying to figure out what is 3 to 5 years away and like pick that to do. And for AI specifically, I did my thesis in 2017 on AI, like in university. I did it for education, and I played with IBM Watson back then, which no one's talking about IBM Watson, but that was like the thing in 2017. I was playing with it, and I was so underwhelmed. And so I just left the space because I was like, all right, this is so far away. Nothing's going to happen. But you found the space, persisted, and then you sort of reaped the rewards like towards the last, 2-3 years or so, right? So I'm curious, what did you see that early on that made you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do? Because to me, it wasn't obvious, but to you, you decided this is what you're going all in on, right?
I mean, if you ask me that question, I think I genuinely don't think it was never a sure shot thing. I don't think in building a company in any point you sort of have that kind of like you have that vision to say like you have a vision to say that this is definitely going to work, right? Because honestly, when we started, the way it got started, we were sort of exploring data science problems across multiple areas, not radiology, just like 4 or 5 different things. And out of all of that, we sort of selected radiology AI as the one that we want to sort of dabble with. And the reasoning behind that and how we sort of looked at all this problem was mostly Kaggle, or there were multiple other data science challenges, websites hosting bunch of challenges. We looked all of that up and we tried doing all of that. Genomics, pathology, tabular healthcare data from healthcare university. So yeah, a bunch of different challenges, and then we landed up on radiology. And the reason was, it was just maybe just was possibly a very amateurish thinking if you now look back at it and realize, but we basically said that where do you have the most amount of signal in the data today? And where do you have the data science algorithms that are actually capable of picking that signal out as much as possible? So it was not about at all, honestly, when we started, it was about TAM or, all this normal metrics that, you look when you sort of pitching to found women investors and all of that. We're just looking at it from a very data science angle, right? So the idea was that, okay, so radiology AI was the reason because we saw that the data obviously had a lot more structure to it, just because at that point in time, there's lot more, I think the data sets coming along publicly or otherwise. And we found there was a signal that we can actually pick things up from there. The second thing we learned was that computer vision algorithms were a lot more robust at that point of time than language. And it just made natural sense for us that, you could see that you can actually achieve 90%, whatever, 80% area under curve pretty easily on imaging data on multiple problems rather than on other problems. And language honestly just developed in last 2-3 years or so. So a lot of it improved drastically, but it wasn't the case in 2016. So from that perspective, it just made sense that here's where you have a lot of data that is at least available or coming up in the market. And then you have an algorithm which can take out the signals. So that I think is one way we sort of like said, looks like a place where we want to sort of play. And then when we went further into that, spend more years or time in it, exactly what the business use case looks like, which disease area to focus, which path or modality to focus. I think all of that became more clear. I don't think it was never at any point of time like, you know what, this is the exact thing we're going to do in it. And we're going to just like, it was not the usual TAM based approach or something like this is where we're going to say. It was more like this seems like a problem we can solve. What better problem can we solve here? And then you sort of go into that journey.
I feel like with deep tech, that's almost inevitable because if there's a really obvious TAM, then like other people are going for it and it becomes hyper competitive very quickly. And the deepness of the tech doesn't stay deep very long. One question, that I had for you was that in the startup industry, there's like sort of the key thing that you get told over and over again, any founder would have heard 1,000 times, any VC would have told the founder 1,000 times is like validate your market. Like if you're building a product, ensure that you have product market fit. In deep tech, that's insanely hard because if your product is 3 years away and you're not even 100% sure what it looks like, how do you validate your market? And so, you talked about how you started with the technology, which I think, a lot of deep tech companies are born out of the love of the technology. And then you spent several years developing it. How early into your journey did you start getting in touch with who you presumed would be your end users? Were you right? Were you wrong? Did you have to change things? How did you do that sort of getting in front of customers when you're dealing with deep tech? Because it's very different in a deep tech company than it is from like a conventional startup.
Yeah, I do not know how different it is. Basically, I've not done the other journey, but when we did it,
well, there's no
honestly,
MVP, right? Like you can't like wrangle something equivalent together with with Airtable and some manual labor.
yeah, yeah. No, fair enough. Honestly, when I'm just recollecting all of it, and it's all like memories coming back. I think when we went about it, I think almost we realized pretty up. I think that the data is a significant part of your journey. Like whatever algorithm you build, the tech is fairly open source, and like ResNets, everything was sort of getting published, and tech in deep learning is almost was pretty open source. So then your major differentiator, the way you can only become more accurate is the amount of data that you can actually put through the system. And I generally don't think when we sort of started building it out, it was very clear to us of who would be the potential users. So we first focused on data and we first focused on getting data so as to make it more accurate, as accurate as possible, right? Because that we clearly saw there was a marked difference. And when we started taking that solution, we saw that accuracy is something that is reliable enough. Not reliable enough. Actually, accuracy was not very reliable, honestly. I think we said that but it looked like there's a trajectory to it. We could put in a bit more data that we got, which was not on public websites, and we sort of got it privately. And we put that into the system, and we could genuinely see there's a marked difference in the performance. So we said, okay, it's happening, right? We put more data, it will become more accurate. So then the question was, what is the business problem that you sort of like? What is a healthcare problem specifically that you try and address? The broad thesis, I think, when we started out was that radiologists are in sort of not in as much in abundance. So, and almost there were at that point of time, if I'm not wrong, there were close to 100 odd radiology AI companies, and like all mostly coming out of like Kaggle challenges, and like the winner or the top 3, top 5 players just like normally get their own company started. It was almost like a wild west in that sense. I think people were building it. And what we realized was, yeah, I mean, we have to sort of narrow it down to like, so this thesis was fairly known to everybody that you have lack of radiologists. If you're going to build an AI solution that can help this growing demand shortage that is going to come in, you possibly would have some value. But it was pretty generic. So people were sort of, I think, yeah, so a lot of companies sort of went around, whoever was there around that time, so they sort of focused on this general problem. And they were basically focused on what are difficult problems for radiologists to solve for, because the idea was that if we can solve the difficult problems for radiologists, that's where they need help with, right? So they can actually, if there's a shortage of radiologists and they're taking a lot of time to read things, you can actually shorten that time, they can do more things. And this, it's very funny now that I'm looking at actually introspecting it, that I think it was based on like what part of the world you were based out of, and your perspective of that problem got defined by that. Because someone in US, let's say where you have actually decent amount of radiologists and not like super short of it, you went for the problems that are harder for radiologists to solve for. Because you obviously saw this, it's not like radiologists are not there, it's just like radiologists are finding it more time consuming or spending a lot of time on problems that are difficult for them. Versus we were based in India. And for us, I mean, the perspective we saw was there's lack of radiologists for sure, but there's almost zero radiologists in a lot of parts of the country. And we actually, instead of going for the harder problems, we actually went for the much easier problems, the lower hanging fruits. And we said that we are potentially going to help doing that because there's a lot of not radiologists available in lots of parts of the country.
I think you threw out a stat on the site that was like, there's one radiologist for every 70,000 people in India or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a 1 in 100,000 or 70,000. That's the number of radiologists you have, which is way lower than lots of parts of the world.
Makes sense.
And so, yeah, so we basically went, because of where we were based out of and what we sort of saw in immediate local...
Sorry, just to contextualize that, that's 1/8 of what it is in the US. So in the US, there's like 8 to 9 per 100,000. So to have like 1 per 100,000 is like a dramatic difference.
Yes, exactly. And in India, you just do not have it. And like, it's just a thing, it's almost like binary to that extent. There are parts of the country where you just do not have it. And so we did not necessarily need to solve for the hardest problem, right? Because the idea was that if you can actually solve for the lowest hanging fruit, you can actually create value. Because there are places where you don't have radiologists, you can just do the basic stuff and that should be fine. But again, just understand that just solving the basic problem did not have much value if you were based in US or somewhere. Because people they're like, I can already do the basic stuff, help me do the more tougher stuff. So that's how I think everyone sort of came up with different hypotheses. And luckily, we sort of ended up on a problem statement around tuberculosis, which, because we thought what was the lowest hanging fruit was chest x-rays. And within chest x-rays, tuberculosis was the problem that we heard, which is made more difficult to diagnose. And once we sort of narrowed that down, I think we started meeting a lot of providers and a lot of people who do tuberculosis eradication throughout 2017. So 2016 is when we started. 2017 early, we got a lot of data. And 17, I think we met people and we sort of said, look, this is what we built. It might not be the most accurate thing out in the world today. And definitely this is going to get a lot better. But if you had this kind of a thing, we want to give it a shot at it and just like see how it goes. So I think it was almost coming back to the question you asked. It was almost 1 year, I think, when we sort of actually started that we actually started interacting with customers to sort of understand what final problem it will be solved. And we did a lot of those conversations to sort of narrow it down. But I still don't think we actually got the full hang of the picture till like another 6, 8 months down the line when we did our first like a live site using it, right? Which is when we actually understood that it's actually how impactful the solution is, right? I mean, honestly, you're still trying to think before that this is a solution. If you can solve it, you're still going to solve for lack of radiologists, and they're going to get a care that they're not otherwise not getting. But when we actually deployed, we actually learned a lot more about like the side-on effects that started happening, right? Because just to give you the story, right, we were in Manila and Philippines and we deployed the solution. It almost took 10, 20 days to get a diagnosis of tuberculosis patients because they would do this on mobile vans that would go out in the remote areas. They would take chest x-rays of patients and then a screening, actually, not patients necessarily, people who they wanted to screen for tuberculosis. Because there's no internet connectivity, they would sort of wait for 4 or 5 days to come back to the city center and then upload the scans on a server for someone to radiologist to read. Now, the radiologist obviously caught up with a bunch of other things, so they take 10, 15 days to read. And after 15 days, you will normally get a report back. But now you have to go back and drive the van back to the place where you screen the patient and then find the patient, then sort of see if they are tuberculosis positive. Then you do this confirmatory sputum test to sort of see if they have actually got tuberculosis or not. And so, yeah, after 15 days, when you say that, okay, this person A has got a likely symptoms of TB on x-rays, you got to do the sputum test. You're going to drive back 2, 3 hours, find the patient, and then do the sputum test. That itself took 1, 2 hours, and then sort of start their medication. What this meant was, firstly, as someone who's got diagnosed of tuberculosis, for 15 days they were undetected. Now, TB is a contagious disease like COVID. So 15 days you're not detected, you're actually spreading that in the community. That's the most important challenge with like tuberculosis eradication. Any contagious disease you have to eradicate, you have to just catch all the patients with one single go, as many as you can, right? And you cannot just let it spread. Second thing that was happening was because you're going back 15 days later, and these are not like real GPS, like it's not like address codes that are very strictly defined, like in Sydney you would have. It's just like you're going to go out and this not, it's difficult to find those patients back because they're temporary addresses. And a lot of times it's not a real discrete address to find them. So there's a lot of follow-up, lost to follow-up cases that are happening. So yeah, and then obviously the cost to find these patients started increasing drastically, right? Because it's just very difficult. And honestly, when we deployed it, we did not have this very great understanding. All we knew was it's very difficult to find radiologists to read. So can you use AI? I said, we'll do it. And they said, will you do it on cloud or can you do it on premise on the van itself? We said, we'll do it on premise if that helps. But on premise was actually, and when deploying, we didn't realize there would be a massive difference. But we realized that because now the vans could go into a remote area, they could just process it on right then and there. And you could just like get like within 30 seconds, you would have a result whether they're likely positive or not. Yeah, and you catch hold of the patient right then and there, get the sputum test done, 1 hour. At best 2 hours, you're done with this entire thing. And if they're positive, you just get them on medication right then and there. You isolate them and do it. So what was almost like a 20-day thing just shortened down to like 2 hours. So this was a massive impact. And a lot of it just was basically doing it offline, which from a computer science perspective, it's almost like you don't spend that much brain thinking that just like on-prem or cloud, like whatever works. It's actually
it's almost always cloud, right? I mean,
cloud, right?
What's really I was going to ask why you guys picked TB, but you've kind of answered that question already. And what's really interesting here is that inevitably, when you get your hands into the thick of a problem, like AI radiologists, you will inevitably uncover all these other problems. And what it sounds like happened in this case was that TB itself, highlights. I mean, what you just talked through highlights yet again some of the fundamental differences between your market location, right? Like that kind of situation that you've described that's happening in India, doesn't happen in, let's say, the US, which is one of the biggest healthcare markets that most people pay attention to because people have definitive addresses and pretty much every clinic will have a really solid internet connection. So you can do cloud-based stuff. And you don't really have these, like, it's probably not going to take 15 days to do a round cycle with the clinic purely from transport. If that's happening, it's just backlog. It's administrative stuff, which are fundamentally different problems. So it's really interesting. Did you, like, when you picked TB, did you pick TB because you identified these issues when you dove into it, or did you pick TB and then discover these issues and that just kind of like made it even more attractive to tackle as a problem? Like, did you kind of get lucky with TB? Do you know what I mean? Or was it a really clinical decision?
No, I mean, that's what I was saying, right? I don't think, I genuinely believe after all these years, I think we've been lucky at different points. But I think what made us choose TB, I think I'll give you that. It was definitely not this entire, like the exact story I told you. I don't think we envisioned it play out. And that's what I was explaining, that I think it's only when we sort of deployed this, we actually got this whole story. But what we did sort of, I mean, the hypothesis on which we built this was, we were meeting a lot of people who have worked on TB, and I think their thing was that, like, this whole X-ray based screening was an idea that used to happen back in 1990s or 80s, and that's how a lot of countries like Japan, US had eradicated TB back in the days, was just by doing X-ray based screening. And come 2000, early 2000, I think that idea got scraped off because there was this rise of molecular testing, right? Microbiology sort of became more cheaper, and after genome sequencing, all of that happened. I think just like said, this is something that is more accurate, right? Because obviously X-ray or something is imaging, so you're just like taking a snap of the lungs and trying to deduce from it. Versus microbiology is a lot more accurate because you're actually just taking the DNA sample, doing so. And so as the years passed by, so that became a lot more mainstream, and this whole idea of X-ray based screening sort of went out, and because you could just, there's a bit more accurate testing that came along. However, in India and all these other places, when we're meeting people, they're like, you know what, this is obviously molecular testing and microbiology is a great idea, but I think it's very expensive. It's at the same point of time. I mean, it's not as expensive if you look in the US context, but when you try and do, because in TB or any disease that you want to eradicate, a contagious disease, screening is the most important thing you can do, right? Because if you have to control or eradicate that, you have to screen as many people as possible. And to screen a lot number of people, you just do not have to do that. You have to get a lot of this microbiological tests in a country like India, which has a very high incidence of TB. I think if I'm again getting the number, there's almost, I think 1 million patients.
I think it's more like, I think it's like 10 million, right? And then 6 million,
10 million
get caught by diagnosis and something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
4 million is undiagnosed. Yeah, right.
It's insane.
So insane, right? And to do that, so imagine if you have to get all this 10 million patients, or even the 6 million that is undiagnosed, you potentially need to screen what we have realized is almost close to 25 million patients on a very regular basis, right? It takes a lot of infrastructure, but it's also a lot of costs. And so everyone suggested that if you can use X-ray, if you can bring back X-ray based screening, what was discarded in 90s, that would be great. But we are like, but why don't you bring it back? Like, what's stopping you guys from like doing it at scale? They're like, oh, we don't just have radiologists enough to just read that, because if we just start doing like 25 or X-ray would be a pretty like it's step before the actual molecular testing, then we have to do a lot more of that. So they're like, yeah, we don't have as many radiologists in this country to read all of that X-rays. And like, so they're like, if you can just use AI to just do that. And so it's also sort of, because in healthcare, I think patient safety is obviously very critical. And especially in those days, when AI was not like a proven thing, you did not want to sort of have, no one would want to take a bet on a decision where just AI takes a look at it and then just says, and you just sort of start taking care. But because the problem statement changed to that idea that, you're not actually doing the diagnosis, but you're basically screening it, and there's a final diagnosis again gonna done. You just sort of doing it at a much cheaper, lower cost infrastructure where you don't have radiologists do that quickly, efficiently. So you just tick off all the boxes for an innovative tech, I think, to sort of function, right, in a real life scenario, which is it's deep, like unbundle it from the actual like diagnosis piece of it, and you make it, but you're still making the process faster or quicker and doing this other gains in the process. So that all boxes got ticked off, and we said, sounds like something we should do and we should build on it. And then, but yeah, only once we went live with the thing and we sort of understood this is just doing this on-prem and in a very fast-paced environment. We delivered this all other things, which we honestly never, we did not think about this whole contagious disease and just like, trying to give a diagnosis within a day or so. It was just about, okay, we don't have radiologists to read X-rays, we'll just use AI to do that.
So maybe diving into the strategic thinking here a little bit more, I'm curious, what drove the decision for your company to seek FDA clearance for your medical device? I mean, given that you're focused in India, what was the advantage of getting FDA clearance? And so just for full context for listeners, Cure AI recently got, I think it was the end of last year, got FDA clearance as a breakthrough device for this TB AI image detection, which is a massive milestone in any company in the healthcare space to get FDA approval for anything. I can speak from experience on that one. And so, it's a huge breakthrough, but I'm curious, like what drove the decision making to go for that? Clinical trials can be expensive. They have high failure rates. I mean, I think it's a little bit easier in med devices as opposed to therapeutics, but it's still a significant capital and risk investment. So what was the thinking behind going for that?
I mean, yeah. So firstly, just for context, so this is now the first FDA breakthrough we got. I mean, this is a possibly our 14th or 15th FDA approval. So our first FDA approval happened in 2020. Yeah, 2020, I think, is the first one we did. So maybe I'll give you context of why we did the first one, and then I can come with the last one, because the first one was obviously way more difficult, way more challenging. Once you sort of get to the first one, you sort of realize how to go about it. The second one is a lot more easy, like almost 10x more easier than the first one, and then from there onwards, you almost know how to go about it every time. So it's actually, so the decision making behind the last one was, it was the strategic thinking of why we wanted to do the tuberculosis part, so which is, I'll explain, come to that later. But I think the first one when we went for it was actually not on tuberculosis. It was on CT heads and sort of this trope idea that we do not have radiologists in a lot of, in US for that matter, or other parts of the world, where there's an after-hour incident around emergency. We just do not again have enough radiologists after hours to sort of look at it. And if you can just like pick that up, triage it to an emergency physician who's on duty at that point of time, that just would make their life easier. And this hypothesis, I think because we had sort of by 2019, 2021, I think we just sort of started seeing that whole tuberculosis play sort of become bigger and bigger, and people picking up on it. I think obviously the next thing was, what's next, right? And then US obviously is a bigger, everyone knows US is a big healthcare market that it is. And we're like, what is a problem, right? And by that time, we are already experienced in solving a problem where there's not a radiologist, right? So we're like, I think we love that genre of problems where there's not a radiologist involved, because there are two, as I said, there are two genre of problems that you could solve for, right? One is where radiologists are there, but they want help with all this complex studies that are done, which takes potentially hours or 2 hours to read, and you just make it a lot more easier for them to read, versus other genre where you don't have radiologists and you just like do the basic stuff and you do that decently well enough compared to a radiologist. You can just help when they're not around.
So just to cut in there, right? Like, why does it take an hour or two to look at an X-ray? Like, can you explain the basics of what a radiologist is doing? Because to me, who has no idea on the space, you just look at the X-ray, you see a blob, and you're like, oh, they have TB. Yeah, that makes sense. And then you just diagnose them. So, like, what is so hard about it?
No, that's exactly what I was saying. So there are two genres of problems in that whole AI radiology space, right? One is the kind of exams where it takes almost 2 hours to read. Those are not your X-rays. Those are normally your PET scans, and you normally do these multimodal MRIs. Whether like an MRI normally consists of 4 different channels. So like how a normal image has RGB, like red, green, and blue, and you actually just see an image. You don't even see all the 3 channels. MRI actually has those 4 different channels, and they're like more and more advanced machines have even more. So literally, when you're seeing one scan, you're almost seeing actually 3D scans of 5 or 6 different modalities at one single go, right? So you're trying to see, and they're 3D scans, which means you have to also take into context like what you saw in the previous scan and like previous slice of that scan, and then like the next slice, because you're looking slice by slice. So it's very time consuming for human eyes, I think, to just consume it. So those are that's one genre of problem. X-ray is not that genre. X-rays is very basic, exactly as you said. It takes hardly 30 seconds to a minute to read an X-ray. Anyone, almost, yeah, a lot of non-radiologists in different parts of the world are trained to read X-rays, because there's just X-rays are done in huge volumes. They're done almost everywhere, every left, right, and center, and we have this huge number of X-rays done. So you just take hardly 30, 40 seconds to do it. So X-ray falls in that second bucket of problems where it's not very difficult to do it. It's not difficult to do it. It's just that if you don't have radiologists, then it's a difficult thing. But if you're ready for a radiologist, it's a very simple thing to do. And so that's the kind of problems we went after, right? As we said, we're going to solve this kind of problems, which are it's yeah. I mean, one very interesting hypothesis we had initially was that if a human being can do it, AI can do it. And if we could, as as someone sort of building the algorithm, could see the reason why a radiologist would make a decision, I think we could make an AI algorithm pick that up. But if as a human being you're not able to do, so we never went for problems. There were also some problems in healthcare, which were like in radiology, which are like superhuman problems, as you would call it, which human radiologists cannot do it. And there were a lot of companies building around the hypothesis that maybe AI, with all the signals that it can capture, it would be able to pick those things out from the images and sort of predict things which are not intuitive to a human eye. And yeah, so we went after problems that are easy, that sort of get it straight. You know how to, you can do it very basically. But then for those kind of problems, you have to find markets where there are not radiologists, and obviously that's how we got the TB. So we were like, okay, if we have to do this in US, US obviously has radiologists, so you cannot actually potentially solve a problem like that there. But then figured this was this out of hours issue that radiologists do have, and we're like, okay, there you go, right? That's one space where you do not have radiologists after almost 7 in the or 8 in the evening to like 8 in the morning. So there's that stretch where you need help, and there's just an on-call radiologist who's normally available to help. So we said that's a problem we're going to solve, and that's how we sort of went with it. And obviously, FDA was required to sort of get and start deployments. So yeah, that's how we did a first FDA. Coming back to the question I think yours, which is the last one, which obviously was a breakthrough device, which was tuberculosis. But that I think was mostly because I think now we are realizing that there is a lot of TB incidents in US that is actually growing, unfortunately. And I think just because of the kind of work that we have done, and not just US, I think some other parts of the world. And I think FDA approval sort of gives you actually it's at the end of the golden standard, right? If you do get past it, it sort of does give you that validation that the algorithm and the product is definitely beyond certain accuracies, that it's actually held. I think so that, yeah, as we now in almost close to 80 odd countries across the globe, I think so it became more important that we actually have it, even for the tuberculosis, although there's no incidence, like there's rising incidence in TB, but not significant. So I don't think the product that we have got the breakthrough, we will not possibly need it right away in US, but I think just across the globe, it just makes a lot more sense.
Well, I'm sure it's also something that can be meaningfully helpful for decreasing healthcare costs overall, right? Because there's not just like a question of whether a human can do it or an AI can do it, but like an AI can do it for significantly cheaper than a human can do it, right? Especially a trained radiologist. And so I think, in places like England, where I think TB has, like, the rate of decrease has slowed, but it's like primarily affects the poor, right? And that's simply because these people generally just have less access to healthcare. Healthcare costs are rising worldwide. And so anything one can do to offset those costs, I think is still valuable to the first world, even where maybe some of the same problems don't exist as existed in India.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I mean, ironically enough, I think as years passed, when we sort of started expanding from India to other parts of the world, and we actually went to UK before we went to US, it was very amazing for me to just like every time I started out with the hypothesis that possibly there's not a lack of radiologic problem here. But ironically, everywhere I went, including the US, it was like this is a very stark shortage of radiologists and everything that sort of comes around with. And UK was actually one of those places I remember, I still is. I think it's a huge, massive shortage. It's actually very comparable to, I think, the India numbers in terms of the incidence of radiologists per 100,000. And US obviously doesn't have that problem on, let's say, a West Coast or an East Coast. Like if you're in LA or SF or New York, you might not have it, but you just get down in other parts of the country in US, you start experiencing similar sort of scale of problems. So it's.
I think it's not quite as bad as India, but it's definitely the lowest rate of radiologists per capita in Europe. I think it's just shy of 7 per 100,000, which is actually not much better than, not much worse rather than the US. I wanted to change gears, like to do a total 180. I know that AJ was pretty keen to talk about this, so I'm going to ask the question, then I'm going to throw it over to AJ to add more clarity. But what was it like to raise a ton of capital? Because I think people, like especially startup founders at the beginning of their journey, they raise their first check, 500K, they raise a few million. What's it like to raise tens upon tens of millions of dollars in a single go? Sounds like a pretty gangster thing to do. I don't know, AJ, if you wanted to add more color to that question.
I think to add context there, I'm curious about how you even think about raising that much money, right? Like, you have something that works, you have a couple of clients using it. Like, how do you sit down and say, okay, we need this much money, right? What was it? 40 million was the raise? I think that's the public amount in 2022. So how do you sit down and say, like, we need $40 million and this is what we're going to do with it, right? Because I don't even know how to even fathom that. So, like, yeah, I guess what was that discussion like? Bring me back into the, your co-working space with your co-founders. You guys are sitting there like, all right, your CEO writes 40 million on the whiteboard and you're like, all right, what are we going to do with this? Like, what was that conversation like?
Yeah, so maybe some bit more context. I think I'll take you back to 2016 actually. So 16 is when we got started, and the way we got started was actually we were incubated by this large analytics company called in India, which was called Fractal Analytics. So they were the ones who sort of gave us office space and a bunch of other things, resources to sort of work with, like healthcare, some connects and all of that as well with some of the earliest users that we sort of had. So they're pretty large analytics. They provide analytics to Fortune 500 companies in the US. So they were the ones who sort of said, just don't worry about like money. You guys get started and build this out. We sort of, we'll see where it goes, sort of a thing, right? So that was an extremely nice place, honestly, to be in, because we just like could focus actually on building some cutting edge products without sort of worrying about revenue right off the bat, or ARRs, MRRs right off the bat. So, but obviously, so they had some equity and they potentially got. They almost, it was, I think, closer to 5, if I'm not wrong, 5 mil. I think that was roughly what we sort of raised from them, right? So, but that sort of was enough for us to build the products and all this. So the first serious raise was like when we actually went out and we raised was, I think, the first round we did with Sequoia, Mass Mutual and all of that. So that was a smaller number, that was 16. And I think the idea was not really to sort of she can try to go back to the boardroom and sort of say what amount and how. And I think I don't think the amount was, when we did the first round, the amount was of like surmount importance to us. I think it was just a lot of other things, and we wanted to genuinely get help from people who have done this in the other space. And just like, and yeah, it was like, is it, what we have built, is this validation enough and all of that, right? And just from all other different perspectives, we want to do the fundraise. And so the 16 number was what, obviously not something we were fixated on. We were like, okay, and anyways, there was already incoming, because we were sort of building something so interesting and like so unique in a country like India. There's not AI SaaS companies in the first place. AI health tech SaaS, almost nil at that point in time. And so it was always excessive. We already had some spotlight anyways within all the media articles. We just got that spotlight. So we already had some incoming interest, I think, in that sense, if I put it. So it was not like we wanted to, like, we were not desperate for it firstly, but I think we were like, I think we got the first users, this whole story happened, and we were like, okay, And now we want to sort of really go out there. I think we were like, the product is built. There's some PMF ideas we already think we have got in there, what we can do. And it was more about now sort of getting the right people so that we can actually take their help to scale it. And we're like, and since there was already a lot of inbound interest, so it was not like very difficult so we went with the Sequoia thing, and I think that was like there was already inbound interest from them, and then we basically the rest of it sort of was more people who had reached out, and then we were like, just the usual negotiation, and that's how we went about it. So it was not the amount was not as was not as critical. It was more about getting the right people in and sort of who can
What
help
do you
us
think
do
was
the next stage.
what do you think was the primary use case? Because typically when I think about raising, right, like for a traditional business, I'm thinking about, purchasing more inventory, right? I'm raising 2 million. I'm going to put some into inventory, or I'm going to put some into ads, or I'm going to start a new team in Japan that's going to do international expansion there. Like I have a use for that quantum of capital to be like, all right, this is what we're going to do. In your case, like how did you guys think about that usage? Was it like going into R&D to develop new things and you want to double down on that, or did you want to expand to new countries? Like how are you thinking about the usage for that capital?
I think the primary idea at that point of time, we were like, okay, there are two things that clearly we wanted to do next, right? One was obviously this whole tuberculosis story that we sort of found this nice fit seemingly in like this very early, I guess, whatever, 10, 15 sites at that point in time in India or Philippines. We wanted to scale that up. That was like first one. The second idea at our end was, can we sort of take this to markets which are like, the first world markets first, right? And US was obviously by default the first that sort of comes to mind. UK was also the other one. But just going into these markets meant going through the FDA process, which is long, mentioned, which is very expensive. It's clinical trials you have to do and all of that. And so we definitely knew we had the capability. I think the tech capability was definitely there because it was more like how we now build the GTM capability, find the product market fit for all of this. And product market fit in US is normally a more expensive process, way more expensive than finding, because in potentiality, US is difficult is just because of the fact that you have to have a very strong hypothesis right off the bat, or at least get a very good sense of that hypothesis. Because if you do not have it, you just in other markets, especially where there's not a regulatory, is the requirements are not as high. You can potentially run 5 experiments, right, and see what sort of clicks. Versus in US, you have to have a very strong hypothesis of, especially if you're constrained capital, you got to have a very strong hypothesis of like what's likely to do, and so you have to spend a lot more time actually doing that before you start investing in the regulatory process. There's like a bunch of things, clinical trials, all of that to actually get that started. So US, that's why it's a lot more expensive. You cannot really go wrong with it, and the word go. So that was the idea. So how can we take what we have done and scale it up in rest parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and then but potentially get into UK, figure out US, all of that, right? So that was part of it. So yeah, that was the first race. Second race was, I think, a lot more like, I think by that time, by the second race came, I think, which is 2021, when we started looking out, right? It was all like we sort of, now we have shown that we could take whatever money we had raised. And again, it was not about like the money was coming to an end or something, and we had very good runway still left. But what we had done by now is we had sort of shown we could scale this to a lot of parts in Southeast Asia and Africa. So that scaling had happened. We could scale that journey. So 0 to 1 was happened. And we had done now almost found closer to 1, I think between 0 to 1, maybe 0.8 in UK and market. We've sort of got the first few pilots, customers, contracts, all of that sort of happened. And yeah, so we said, okay, we not only have been able, like, we're not this, what do you say, single pony, like single trick pony, right?
One trick
Which
pony,
is
yeah.
now actually one trick pony. That's it. Not that, and we just actually could have, we have expanded to UK. We can take the same underlying technology around Nexus, but find a very different use case, which is not TB, which was completely different around lung cancer. We've sort of got the first contract with pharma. So we had expanded also into pharma and working with pharma to sort of build on there.
At what point in this journey did you guys become profitable?
I think profitable is still, I think, not a thing that I think we are still there. I think we are on the path to profitability, I think. But yeah, because I think for us, the ongoing R&D cost is still pretty high. I think so. And the idea is at this point of time, yeah, we're sort of trying to build what is next, right? Because there's a lot of other markets, and like US obviously want to go bigger and better. So from a business unit perspective, we are obviously profitable. Right? If you look at like what we're doing in global health and all our major costs that normally go is this R&D, which is not amortized or across segments.
Okay, so to go in another direction, and I guess this question is for both of you guys. I'm curious about what your teams look like in this case, because Rohit, your teams, I think, what, 200 people or so, and like I'm curious about the culture in a deep tech company versus, like I would say, an entry level. I found the hard way that the people that stick around and the people that are great are usually people who are really passionate about the mission. So they get excited when we get like a comment from a user or a really good customer review saying that we changed their life and they got like a new job. I'm curious, like, what do your team members care about? Is it saving lives? Is it the tech? Are they like really nerdy and just like will live and die for like looking at tech all day? Like, what are they like typically? And I guess what's the culture like in your companies?
You go for it, Rohit. You start.
Okay. I think for us, if I'm just looking at the broad company, I think when we started, because it was like, I don't know, I mean, a lot of it was tech. I think we did all major co-founders. I think all of us came from tech background. I think so we had a major, I think the tech overhang, as you say, but it was just a lot of inspiration from Google. And you just like read those stories, you know your friends. So you just sort of somehow, it is Google, that whole culture you read in the books, Eric Smith. I think you just like, and then the Netflix book, I'm forgetting now, the culture. We are heavily inspired by it. Just like, I think it's just a very tech thing. We just like, this idea of like, open cultures where basically it's all outcome driven, not like tracking times, all of that, right? So not, and especially in India, there's like because a lot of outsourcing work happens or used to happen at that in the day. A lot of the work culture normally is driven by like, tracking actually times and all that. We are very clear we never want to touch any of that, even remotely. Like all the things that you normally read in the books, we just almost, I think, took it as a Bible and we just said we're gonna go ahead with it. So we just like, making the idea, I think the three things we said, like complete trust, transparency, and ownership. I think that's basically, we said, the three pillars. And there's no like that whole culture of like shaking. And it's a small thing. I think it's very easy to do, especially if everyone's sort of coming from there. So that was one thing that I think I primarily realized it was the basis of our culture as it started, because it was like no one's checking on anyone. Like just like and if you have a problem, you just discuss openly, and everyone's sort of coming up with solutions. It's not about which team you're part of, how you come up with it. I think this is all you read in this book. I remember because I read those books and I was like, yeah, these are the exact things you're gonna do. Like you just put up challenges, like put it on a Slack, just post whatever you have as a problem, just like let people chime in. And that whole open culture sort of coming in, the no leave policies, right? So no one's tracking leave and none of that thing. So that was one part of it. That was in terms of like what we said we were going to do as a culture, and we did. The second thing is because all of us mostly started from non-healthcare backgrounds, right? And we almost like got into healthcare out of zero. So that sort of created a confidence, or you can just say the subculture, where you sort of like, we said, okay, I mean, maybe the healthcare background is not even needed, right? I mean, you don't need to hire AI folks. Anyways, tech folks, it was way more difficult. Obviously, very difficult to find people who are doing deep learning, forget deep learning in healthcare. So we said we just need smartest folks, and we did that across the board. We just said in whatever, whether it's in sales team or whether it's in product team, and we just literally hired people who we just thought done, like for most people that we hired in sales, that's right, a place where you normally think that you need people who are seasoned, network and all of that. We just said, I mean, because I'd done it myself without any network, I said, you know what, I possibly don't need it. You just need a bunch of smart, driven, hungry folks who are just literally out there to do it. And even if they've not done a $0 value of sales earlier, because again, I came from a tech background and I was like, I don't care if you come from a tech background, product background, whatever you do. Are you hungry to sort of like just go out there, just like see this thing that you build it and take an ownership of it and build it? And that sort of, I think, works to a good extent. I think at Cure, I think that we could give ownership to very smart people, let them punch above their weights, and then that just sort of work for everyone.
What do you guys celebrate? Like, what's news that the entire team would like celebrate? So, for example, in our team, every week we have a section with like customer wins or like student wins. So anything that we see on social media where someone's got a job or someone said a really cool thing about us, like we spend 10 minutes every Monday, we sort of go through it, and that gets everyone pumped up for the week. Do you guys celebrate, I don't know, R&D wins? Do you celebrate, the FDA news? Like, what kind of stuff is like exciting for everyone that gets you all like pumped up?
I think for us, every new, I'm just looking at it, I think all of this news gets excited. I think the most impactful, I think, yeah, everything, right? Normally new customer, someone, because every time there's a new customer, that means someone took a leap of faith, right? And that's great. FDA news, that's great, right? And all of that. But I think the most impactful news that actually I've seen across the board is actually the stories, patient stories of someone who was, let's say, if I had not intervened, wouldn't have received a treatment or would have died very likely in case of a stroke, and then they actually helped do that. Those kind of things, I think people just actually to see that, I think for me, that just, yeah, for me also personally, that just like creates a very deep sense of impact that you actually did save someone's life. And then you just forget everything that you build. You just like, you save someone's life, and that just worth, a single person's life saved is just worth so much in value. Like, I don't care as much honestly about the rest of the stuff. So I think that deep sense of impact stories, as when we hear someone share a snippet or someone just said a physician normally sends it on text or something, and that just is massive. I think that. But I'm curious, by the way, long from you to hear how the story, what's the culture at your end.
Yeah, I think like we're still, we're still pre-market. So although we do a lot of commercial work with partners, I guess it's not fair to say we're pre-market. We do have a lot of paid work that we do, and a lot of like partnerships that we have, but we're still very early in that. So it's like, single digit customers, and you're putting a lot of focus into those first customers. So I think like wins celebrated, definitely, whenever you land a new customer, that's still like a big win. Like it's a beautiful moment when you move to a scale that each customer sign up is not like a thing that the whole team's like, woo, that it's just like it's happening so often. It's a beautiful moment when you get to that. We're not quite at that stage yet. It'll probably be several months before we are. But I think one of the, just today we had a whole team, I guess, celebration. Our R&D unit broke one of the world records recently. And so it was just an opportunity for the head of our research team to come together and sort of talk about that for the whole company. And like, obviously it's a very deep technical achievement, but like, what does it actually mean? What went into it? What were the major contributions that made this possible? And this, we're lucky. We've got a really good R&D team. Like, this happens with some regularity that we can break world records. I think publications are always, something that you can celebrate. To answer AJ's like opening question around like culture, I do think there's a mix. I would say heavily it's a bunch of nerds that are just like fall in love with building solutions to hard problems. That comes with some challenges. Like, there's this thing called nerd sniping, which if you get really smart people and you just like, to your point, you just throw them a problem on Slack, they'll just get super into it. And that's great. And it's a good culture to have, but you've got to balance that with like, okay, but Bob, it's great that you're helping Alice with this problem that she's posed, but like, you also have your own shit that you need to do. So you can't like just railroad yourself for 3 whole days. I think that can be somewhat mitigated by having very clear individual deliverables and very clear like team deliverables and company things, so that the team can sort of understand how to balance because you also don't want the opposite. You don't want people just in their silos and they're not like thinking about the broader context in which their work is done. I would say that's probably one of my biggest failings as a leader, if you want to call it that, is like constantly having to like give people that full context. Like, this little piece of work that you're doing matters because it's going to be a part of this piece of work, which is going to be part of this piece of work, which is ultimately going to design a drug. And designing a drug is an insane thing that requires so many different moving parts, and it's very, very hard to point at one part and say that's the bit that designed the drug. You needed 12 bits and not a single one of them could have not worked. But we, on the other side, we do have people in the team that are incredibly passionate about the problems, and they don't give a shit about the solutions. Like they just want to treat this disease, and that's all that matters. And I think you need that mix, because you need people who can fall in love with a solution and really drive it, but you need people who 100% focus on the problem, because that's where you have impact, is by solving a problem. And we always talk about this idea of don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem. Because if you can find any solution to the problem, that's good. Whereas if you just perfect the solution, but it's not actually the associated problem's not real or it's not impactful, then who cares that you've, built this really cool piece of tech that's really fun, but doesn't make a difference in the world. Now, having said that, I think our whole team loves the fact that the ultimate application of their work is drug discovery. As a process that takes 20 years. And so it is, I think, uniquely challenging in a life science company. How do you feel that impact that you're having on the world when, if you just look at the most obvious thing, which is, did you build a drug? It's a 20-year timeline. It's really, really, I recently had dinner with a guy who one of the drugs that he designed had been approved by the FDA that week. And so we were having dinner and he was very happy about it and he was excited. He's like, I bought this bottle of champagne 15 years ago that I now get to open. And it's like, wait, hang on a second. You haven't worked on this drug for 10 years. Like, your initial work, like you designed it, you did all the thing, whatever, you got it through. But like, then you stopped working on it because it exited your part of the expertise required to get this thing to market. And then you didn't think about it for 10 years. And then every couple of years you see in the news, okay, it's made this milestone, this milestone, this milestone. It's a huge challenge. And to be honest, I don't know I hope we're solving it. I hope we're able to drive that excitement in the team. But, constant reflection, I guess, is needed to see whether we're doing it the right way.
Well, this is why I asked, right? Because you guys are working on such big, long projects sometimes that you kind of need to have micro celebrations on the way. Otherwise, your team just it's really hard to get G'd up for a 4-year goal or a 10-year goal, right? So you got to figure out smaller ways.
I was actually thinking the same thing, right? I mean, when Long was saying, I think I was like, I'm now looking at it. I think the things that we celebrate over time actually has changed. And I mean, I just remembering it early on. I think 2017, 18 was actually the publication, not a patent that we were doing. 2019, 20, 21 was more like new customers that we were sort of winning, I think. Then to come 2020, 20 it was revenue numbers, all of that we were selling, because the wins became so commonplace and we sort of just measuring that. And then once that revenue things now become more important, I think now finally once you get to that stage, I think it's just the stories that actually start making. So just what becomes mainstream, then some other celebration takes the center stage, right? So that's one thing I think. And there was something I think you mentioned long about this whole. I think because you were saying and I was reflecting on it, and I think exactly to what you said. I think even the culture that I just remember on ownership, for example, and it's almost a two-way sword, right? Because I think ownership is great as an idea to sort of. Everyone feels empowered, but I think the empowerment comes also at a lot of cost, right? Because, and especially that I realize as a company starts growing, it's very difficult to preserve that culture, right? Because in a smaller team, it's very easy to empower everyone, and everyone has very meaningful deliverables and goals. So it's not very, and everyone, what's happening. But once you start going a bit remote, you have people in other places, and you have teams, and there's a lot more people coming in. The empowerment thing itself sort of, because then the ownership sort of, you need to be giving ownership of things that you can actually give attribution to, right, and give actual decision making to, right, because Smart people genuinely expect, I think, ownership with decision making and authority. And if you're not only able to give that, I think then it becomes even more difficult. Versus how much decision making can you actually trickle it down is also a more difficult problem to solve. So I think it just gets more and more difficult with more people that you get. I think that's one thing I realized. Culture, normally whatever you start with and it's in 30, 40, 50, I think you still kind of preserve it. As it starts growing, it just becomes very difficult to sort of, and you need to sort of constantly change the understanding of that subculture more.
Yeah, it almost becomes more important as you scale, right? Because at a very micro level, you can control a lot of things, but when your team gets big, you can only really control the culture and like the high level vision for things. So yeah, it makes sense. So final question. I'm curious, like, what are you interested in right now? And by the way, to take the pressure off, because I know you could go in 50 different directions, I'm currently interested in Sudoku. So I've been solving expert level Sudokus this week, which has been really interesting. They get pretty hard, and I've been solving them maybe 30 minutes a day or so. That's what I've been interested in. What are you interested in? Like, what's got your fascination recently?
I mean, while I've been staying in Sydney, I think I've been very fascinated with pickleball. I don't know, I've never played that sport. I've been a pretty good tennis. I've played tennis to some good extent in India. I never heard about pickleball till like almost 6, 7 months back. When I picked it up, I think I've been just like absolutely phenomenal. I think we started playing training sessions for it and all of that. So and I love sports. I think genuinely because you mentioned Sudoku, that was I think just pickleball is this thing that I'm just like pretty much raged on right now. But that's on sports, and I think I'm just trying to honestly just the healthcare space. I think now after 8 years, I think you just realize what works, what doesn't work, because again, when we went about it, was a lot more like problem statement driven, problem driven, but very less of it was like uh, sort of looking at from a broad 7 foot high kind of a 30 foot perspective. It was never a 30 foot perspective. It was actually like like, okay, this problem seems nice. This is a problem that potentially should be solvable, and then you go on and on. And I think based on those insights, I think getting a lot of ideas about how healthcare potentially could look like from just now you've sort of seen that trend shifts over like at least 1 or 2 cycles of it. So I think just understanding what's happening in healthcare, where healthcare is moved, and especially new ideas around. I think drug discovery, for example, was one thing that I've been reading on and really just like.
Oh yeah, if you want to start an adventure in AI and drug discovery, I might know someone.
Let's chat. I would have, I was actually going on the Kaggle because I think again I've not stopped using Kaggle. I think I've stopped active coding almost 5, 6 years. I was going through it and I saw these challenges on protein binding affinities. And I was like, okay, this sounds. Then I started reading and like reading a bit more. Diagnostics also, I think this whole biopsy kind of stuff. I think so. I've been like pretty interested. I think what's happening in that space.
It's the other side of the coin from healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't had to think about doctors for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, exactly. I was like, I've done this provider side of things at a very good stretch now. I think we have worked with pharma now, so I think I know what pharma is interested in and what they're. I've almost worked with the AstraZeneca. I think there's almost 7 or 8 different pharma companies, but mostly in lung cancer. And like, I think I know, and especially with and Novo Holdings, if you remember, is one of the last fundraise we did. And obviously, if you follow Novo Holdings and their journey and what has happened with Ozempic, and that's been like the blockbuster drug, GLP-1 drugs, is like the big rage and almost as Novo, obviously, that's how they made a lot of money. They're making a lot of money, but it just become a rage even in India. I didn't realize it was yesterday. I was chatting with someone and that like craze that people have even here. And it's not even legal here. That's basically the funny part of it, right? There's no manufacturing. Still, people want to get access to GLP-1 drug. That's how big it has become. US obviously has been massive success. So I think that whole idea of this Ozempic and this bunch of other GLP-1 trials now happening, but I think the whole idea of combination therapeutics, right? The idea that you can actually have a drug which sort of together addresses diabetes as well as weight loss, right? That idea itself is a pretty interesting space, and I'm pretty sure a lot of more pharma. But yeah, I think the use cases that you sort of can come up with, I think from a provider space, I found it a bit more guardrail versus because at the end of the provider use cases are sort of constrained by the margins that most of the provider hospitals operate, which is not a very huge margin, most are very thin. Versus pharma, I think the upsides are pretty solidly scalable if you can actually solve a problem that can deeply meaningful, impactful. I mean, you have a very, very large scaling, and Cure, we saw that. I mean, we started working with pharma almost in late 2021 or so, and just in the last 3 years, we've just been adopted by a bunch of pharma companies in different ways, and it makes a very natural use case for them, and they just have a lot more openness to innovation as compared to providers, just because of the margins and how it operates.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Rohit. I think this is pretty fascinating. I was always curious about how people go from zero to, raising 50 million for deep tech and like what that process looks like. And I think this is the first time I've got to see it from start to finish. So I really appreciate the context and you going through it. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks a lot for firstly meeting me the other day. I think I'm in Sydney. I'm just loving. I just want to get back to that vibe of meeting. I think I missed that thing the most in Sydney. I think, and that's one of the major reasons why I started enjoying pickleball. Is I finally can meet people and just just chat about what's happening, just understand different. So I love, and I was genuinely grateful that you actually agreed to meet. We spend I was missing that vibe for the longest, and absolutely enjoyed this conversation thoroughly. And I like once I'm back in Sydney, I would again love to let's catch up long